So in this lecture, we're going to talk about African American and Mexican American voice in the late 1940s and early 50s in Texas specifically, and how the movement really gains a little bit of momentum. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening within the United States to gain a little bit more context, but it's essentially going to be focused on what's happening in Texas. We're also going to talk a little bit about economic and educational reform, and economic offshore drilling that happens, and some educational reform that happens and still affects us here today. One thing that happens post World War II is there's a major migration to what's known as the Sun Belt. And so Texas, as you can see, if I move myself out of the way, you can see that is actually part of the Sun Belt. So just like with the invention of the air conditioner that we talked about last time, we see people willing to move down to these warmer climates. The other thing that really helps this massive movement to the south is the fact that roads are created and also defense industries move south, cheaper cost of living and things like that. And people like LBJ and other, congressmen push for more military bases to be created in the South. And with the military buildup of the Cold War, that's going to be very essential to Texas economy. Now, the demographics of Texas change somewhat as well. The population increases a lot by about 25%. Most of that increase is coming from rural to urban areas. And you can see the numbers here, right? That it's jumping up by 1950 to almost 60%. Mexican American and African American begin, like I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, really begin to flex this political power that they have. At this time, there is a pretty moderate Democrat as governor, a man named Buford Chester. Now, he really refused to talk about racial integration and things like that, but the next governor, because Buford Chester is going to die in office, and his lieutenant governor, Shivers, will rise to power, definitely has a viewpoint on it, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. So I told you I wanted to mention a couple things regarding education and economic reform. So there were a couple big acts that happened in Texas. One was known as the Gilmer-Aiken Act, which essentially equalized funding, supposedly in Texas at that time, and basically consolidated from 4,500 districts to 2,900, so made them larger districts to oversee, and gave them funding based on attendance. So that's why we have compulsory attendance today, is because of this act. It also established like a minimum 175 days of teaching. It gave teachers a pay raise. The State Board of Education is created, which is an elected position. There's 19 people as part of this. This is also the time period that Texas football really rises to power, and Texas coaches do. There's a really interesting book called, I think it's called Pigskin Pulpit by Ty Cashin. He's a professor from Sam Houston State University that talks about the history of Texas football, if you're interested in that. Another really big thing that happens too are some other economic reforms, and that is mainly to expand the road system. So you may not realize that Texas actually, well, maybe you aren't surprised by this, has the largest farm to market road, which is the back roads in the United States. Okay, and so you can take a look at some of those numbers, $15 million, and then there was things added saying you had to set aside a certain amount of money every year. That is still in the books in Texas in order to improve and create more roads. There's also an increase in medical facilities. In Houston, for instance, the Texas Medical Center has like 134 acres, and by 2000 is the largest physically wise medical center in the world. And so that's also when MD Anderson forms and things like that in the medical center in Houston. All right, so now we're going to talk about the early Mexican American civil rights. Now, previously we have talked about LULAC before, but in Texas, I don't think much attention is paid to the Mexican American civil rights movement and how the NAACP actually observes and watches a lot of these events that LULAC is participating in the American GI Forum, which I'll talk about here in just a minute. Do in order to get segregation and to get more rights gained for Mexican Americans. And so one thing too is that we need to understand that there was an effort by LULAC and the GI forums to separate from the word Mexican and to call themselves Latin American, which is actually in LULAC's name. They actually argued their own whiteness, and they said that whites can't separate whites. And so that was part of their first arguments. That's, changed over time, their stances has, but initially that was their tactic. And so in order to understand this, I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about the term whiteness. Okay, when I say this, when I use this term, we need to think about, it's whiteness essentially meant tangible property rights, educational opportunities, career advancement, and native-born whites, which means that like Anglos, kind of assign immigrants this non-white status. And so LULAC and American GI Forum are fighting this status that they've been given. One of the most successful cases early on was this case called Delgado versus Bastrop in 1948. Basically, they sued and won to LULAC and the American GI Forum to end de facto segregation in schools. And because some of the schools, and de facto, if you might remember, is one that's not written in law, but it's just done because that's the way it's always done. But some schools were exclusively for Mexican Americans only. So that's why we call that de facto segregation. If you're wondering about this transition of the term whiteness in Texas as it relates to Texas, it's a really excellent book. And of course, I don't have it here. I have it at school. Otherwise, I'd show it to you. But it's Nick Foley, Foley's The White Scourge. And I think the formal title is The White Scourge, Mexicans, Blacks, and Poor Whites in Texas. And so it's a really excellent book that really talks about this transition and the fight for this idea of whiteness. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit. I told you I'd explain the American GI Forum a little bit, and there's a video clip here that actually explains this case and talks about the American GI Forum a little bit. But essentially, just like I mentioned last time, the GI Bill was not really accessible to people of color. So Dr. Hector Garcia organizes the American GI Forum, which essentially was initially created just to help Mexican Americans access their GI Bill rights, and it really develops into this more broad civil rights organization. The case that really pushes them to national prominence was that of it's called the Longoria affair. If you ever want to look it up, or actually the video will show you this too. But it regarded a man named Private Felix Longoria, who is actually a World War II veteran, very highly decorated, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Good Conduct Medal, Combat Infantry, and he came back for burial at this town called Three Rivers in Texas. And the funeral director tells the widow, the very soft-spoken widow of Felix Longoria, that the whites won't like it. And so this sets off this huge response by the Mexican American community. And Dr. Garcia, launches into action. He petitions several people. And he actually sends a letter to several senators. LBJ responds and gets him a full burial with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. And so in just a sec, I'm going to show you the telegram that actually shows what LBJ responded and how he wanted to get full honors for Felix Longoria. And so you can actually see here the Western Union, and I'll let you pause this if you would like to read this, but this is the telegram from LBJ responding to this. Now we're going to switch gears. We're going to talk about the African Americans and fighting for civil rights. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more broadly and talk about what was happening nationally, but also what was happening in Texas, because it had a great effect on what was happening nationally with the NAACP and with African Americans. And so in the 1940s, remember the NAACP was founded in 1909, and at first they started to try to gain economic and political rights and social rights by trying to convince the legislature and the president. But when that kind of doesn't work out for them, they change tactics. And remember, they're watching LULAC and other successful organizations attack it in the courts, and they find it to be a really good tactic. And so the leader of this group, or the leader of these NAACP lawyers, was a young lawyer by the name of Thurgood Marshall. Now, he's later on going to go on to be the first African American Supreme Court Justice of the United States. So I'm a huge Thurgood Marshall fan. But initially, some major cases that he was involved in it, and some that you probably have never heard of. One was Sweat versus Painter, and this actually was in Texas. So what happened was there was a man named Herman Sweat, and he challenged the UT president, a guy named T.S. Painter at the time. He had very stereotypical views on race, and essentially he wasn't allowed into the law school. His challenge was, well, where I go to law school is going to have an effect on where I can get a job. And so essentially they were able to prove that there was no possible way that this was separate but equal, or could be. One of the black colleges couldn't be separate but equal because it wasn't as prestigious as UT Austin's law school, and he wins. And so the case was won in 1950. Unfortunately, though, this only applied to secondary institutions or to collegiate institutions, not to K through 12. And so that's going to have to be fought at a different level. Okay, switching back again to legal fights for Mexican Americans, another significant case that you may not have heard of that took place in Texas was one called Hernandez v. Texas. So what happened in this was that an all-white jury in Edna, Texas, essentially convicted Pete Hernandez of murder. Okay, so basically LULAC and the GI Forum sued, saying that the 14th Amendment was violated because the jury was all white. They were only putting people on the jury that had, Anglo names. Anybody that had a Mexican or Spanish surname was excluded from the jury. They were able to prove that, and they won in a unanimous verdict in 1954 before Brown versus Board of Education. So it didn't apply, unfortunately, to blacks at the time because they were petitioning on the basis of class and the name, and not petitioning on race. But one case that is affected for African Americans and for Mexican Americans as well is the Brown versus Board of Education case done by the NAACP. And in this case, Thurgood Marshall, this was a landmark case. And I have a clip of that as well on here, but basically challenged the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal doctrine that allowed and legalized segregation to begin with. And so Earl Warren was the Chief Justice, and he was the one that was sitting on the bench that was passing all the other significant civil rights legislation. So he had the right Supreme Court and the right audience, and they in fact overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which was enormous, and essentially said anytime you have to create something separate, it's inherently unequal. And so this gets passed, and it says in it, though very broadly, that called for desegregation of schools with all deliberate speed. Now, that is a really broad term that is very hard to distinguish what you mean, okay? And as you can imagine, the southern states are really going to try to resist this, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. Meanwhile, regarding, politics and oil in Texas happening at the same time, as I mentioned before, Governor Buford died in office, and so a new governor takes charge, and he has very staunch views on segregated facilities. He was not a desegregationist. As a matter of fact, the people that followed him were known as the Shivercrats because they essentially followed what the Dixiecrats believed. He does improve roads. He goes for prison reforms. He does car safety. So there were some positive things that he does. But we'll talk about him in just a little bit more about him in just a minute. Important to note, and this is when we start to see the shift, and we eventually will see the Dixiecrats and the Shivercrats for that morph into the Republican Party, is that he did support Eisenhower, who was a Republican. I do want to mention, though, that Eisenhower was actually so moderate that he was right in the middle. He was very much a centrist, and so Actually, the Democrats and the Republicans wanted him as a presidential candidate. He was a World War II hero. Another person that actually does see herself as a Republican was Oveta Kapabi. She was the former director of the Women's Army Corps. You might remember me talking about her last time. She supported Eisenhower, became the first Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. So she's kind of a well-known person and Texan at that. So I mentioned I would talk about offshore drilling a little bit. And so I don't want to spend too much time on this, so we'll talk about it a little bit more in the next few lectures. But essentially, there was oil discovered offshore, about 10.5 miles offshore. And California, just to give you some context on this, had actually had a similar instance in which they tried to claim that it was their territory, but they lost to federal authorities. And so Texans were kind of tense about this issue. As a matter of fact, it was the #1 issue in the presidential election in 1950. Eisenhower promises to support Texans, and so they vote for him. And he does sign into law the Quit Claim Bill, which allowed the states to have power in the Gulf of Mexico, which positively helps both Texas and Florida. And just to put in perspective on how important this was to the Texas government economy, by 1987, $2 billion were generated from offshore drilling leases, rentals, and royalties for the Texas government, which mainly supported schools. Now I'm going to talk about another big topic that I'm not going to be able to give the real time that it should be allotted, but that is the fact that the Cold War is happening. And a lot of people try to separate Cold War and civil rights movement, but they're basically, the movements are intertwined in a lot of different ways. And that's because many people associated union groups, civil rights groups with communist organizations. And so this was an effort by a lot of very conservative groups in order to cast them into this light. And one such person was a man named Joseph McCarthy, where we get the term McCarthyism, which means like extreme fear. And he literally caused like a huge panic known as the Red Scare, right, in the United States, in which he said he was going to produce like a list of 200 state employees that had ties to the communist government, which he never did produce. And eventually he is disgraced and discredited when he actually claimed that General George Marshall was actually a communist as well. And so it eventually is fleshed out, but there's this group that a lot of Texans belong to called the House of Un-American Activities. It was actually a committee in Congress. There's a political cartoon that's going to show you basically what people thought of this. This really big, for lack of a better term, witch hunt against people. And it's not to say that there weren't actual spies. There were spies that were found. It was just taken to like the next level of kind of freaking out. Just to kind of put this in perspective too, there was some belief that, by people in Texas, that there were some young white girls that were, liberal white girls that were communists that were having sex with black men to bait them into the communist movements, which they said the NAACP, LULAC, and all kinds of organizations were communist groups. So here's, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you can pause and take a look. But this is a great political cartoon that basically says this, how it had just gotten completely out of control, the anti-communist sentiment. There was also a group of women known as the Minute Women of the United States, and a huge faction of them was here in Texas as well. But they were formed in order to fight communists in government, education, ensure schools taught American heritage, right? Yes, I'm talking about 1951, not 2023. But it was formed in Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Wichita Falls, large groups of them. They supported segregation. They were mainly wealthy, upper class women, white women. They did support the oil industry, and they opposed any kind of national health care too. Here's a news script from them, and which I thought was kind of interesting, from a Fort Worth TV station. So this kind of tells you like how they wanted to brand themselves. Okay. Also wanted to mention like the reaction to the Brown versus Board of Education case, which said very loosely that schools need to desegregate with all deliberate speed. Well, as you can imagine, people in the South very much bucked this idea of integration, and it caused a huge revival of the KKK. And there was something known as the Southern Manifesto. I've got an excerpt from it in the next slide, so you can kind of pause it and read that. But some Texas representatives also signed, like these 19 senators and 82 representatives, House of Representatives members did include Texans. But basically, the South kind of garners itself to literally try to stop segregation or desegregation from happening. This is the time of the Little Rock Nine, in which the 9 students tried to enter Little Rock and the federal government had to intervene. This is, that was in 1957. But there was also people in the South like George Wallace, and he'll run for governor, run for president a little later on. He was the governor from Alabama. And he said, very famously, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So this kind of tells you what the mentality of many people were in the South at the time on desegregation. So you can see this. I took this excerpt. You can click on that link to visit the Teaching American History page. It's got like a little excerpt explaining the Southern Manifesto and has the full thing. But this is, in essence, part of it. This unwarranted exercise of power by the court, contrary to the Constitution, is creating chaos and confusion in the states principally affected. It is destroying the amicable relations between white and Negro races that have been created through 90 years of patient effort by the good people of both races. It has planted hatred and suspicion, whereas therefore friendship and understanding. Right. So anyway, that's that kind of interesting excerpt. So I do want to also talk about, which I think this is a really interesting case, Little Rock Nine. Again, I might put a clip of Little Rock Nine. That's a more well-known case. But something to understand is that the NAACP positioned itself to take on segregation chapter by chapter. Okay, and this is throughout the United States. In Virginia, there was a group called the Norfolk 17. Little Rock, there was a group called the Little Rock Nine, and essentially what happens is that they vet not only the students, but the families of these students, potential students. They have to be of highest acumen possible because they've received an inferior education to this point. So they needed to make sure that these students were academically prepared for these white schools, but also mentally prepared for these white schools. And so, as you can imagine, there's great resistance to them integrating into these schools. And case in point was in Mansfield, Texas in 1956, when 3 African American students attempted to enroll in Mansfield High School. So they were blocked. The local community resisted. Actually, the local mayor and the police chief sided with the white residents that were opposing the integration. The NAACP chapter in that area, in the Fort Worth area, filed suit. The federal courts ordered Mansfield to desegregate. And they absolutely, Texas responded very negatively. They didn't do anything, like they wouldn't allow them to integrate. This is a headline from that. This is what's called an effigy, which is like what they used during the American Revolution to the tax officials many times. But they hung 3 effigies where they hung them. Which is horrible. It's not them, but it's supposed to look like them to intimidate them not to come into the school. The Texas Rangers were sent out. Governor Shivers, remember, is a staunch segregationist, and so remember the Shivercrats, and so he does not support integration. So he sends the Texas Rangers to preserve the status quo, which is a white school. And the Texas legislature the next year quickly passes a law to allow local districts to segregate. And there were some places that were already segregating, like San Antonio and El Paso, but unfortunately the Texas legislature did not desegregate until they were forced to with the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and 1965. So unfortunately, and in some areas they don't even desegregate until the 1970s. So can you imagine, 1954, the law was passed, and this tells you how much fight people had to do this. But we'll talk about the 1960s and 1970s in Texas. The civil rights movement is going to amp up. Tensions are going to amp up. The Vietnam War is going to happen. And so we'll talk about that in the next lecture.